Hello. Is there such thing as toxic masculinity? And is testosterone a poisonous toxin? Let's discuss. Welcome to the Forge and Anvil podcast, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the race set before us. My name is Connor. I'm host of this podcast. Today, I wanted to talk about manhood and masculinity. We live in a culture that is oftentimes overtly against masculinity altogether, and these conversations oftentimes are not had in very healthy spaces. This has caused many men to retreat to small subcultures and find sometimes controversial figures to actually guide them through manhood. Oftentimes, they will even retreat into themselves and avoid talking altogether. Authors like John Eldredge have voiced concerns that the church has hurt masculinity as well and have raised a generation of men who are dutiful, detached from their heart, and bored. My goal for today is at least to scratch the surface of this topic with a guest who has a lot of experience with these conversations, Will Spencer from Renaissance of Men. So, Will, say hi.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, who are you and what do you do?
I'm the founder of the Renaissance of Men. It's a podcast. So I found I didn't start the Renaissance of Men. Let me put it this way: I observed it, and the Renaissance of Men is a 40-year process to rebirth masculinity. It's been happening. It's been happening for 4 decades since the 1980s, and I found my way into this larger process called the Renaissance in the 2000s. And through exploring the teachers and the authors and the books, and then eventually the videos, I was able to transform my life as a man. And then I set out to tell more men about the Renaissance, because I think men need to know that something so significant and so big has been going on for so long. And so my podcast is to interview the leaders and the authors and the speakers and the content creators that are really making it go and driving the dialogue in multiple different ways. And then I also have a men's coaching business, men's mentorship business, and men's groups as well, as long as the content as well as the content creation I do.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, tell me more about Renaissance of Men. First of all, where did you get the name?
The Renaissance of Men was what I called this thing that I observed,
Hmm.
because I had read so many of these different books, and I had been to retreats, and I was watching videos, and I observed that all these different kind of themes came up in waves. So you mentioned John Eldredge, and John Eldredge was actually writing, I believe, in the late '90s was when he
Yeah.
wrote Wild at Heart. But before him, there were these authors called the Mythopoetic Men's Movement,
Mhm.
Robert Bly and Douglas Gillette. Along with them was another man named Warren Farrell. And so I read all these books, which were all in the '80s and the '90s. And then I observed the way that the dialogue changed as you move from the '80s and '90s into the 2000s, into the 2010s, and then up until 2020, which is when I coined the name. And it was almost like there was this process that was happening to build a bunch of different ideas together as men were rediscovering what it meant to be a man. And then what was going to come out on the other side of that was this renewed understanding, this rebirth of masculinity. And so I remember thinking that, well, it's a little bit like there's no leader of this. There's no one guy who's driving the whole thing. Like Jordan
Right.
Peterson is of course very popular, but he wasn't driving the thing. He was just one part of it. And you had all these different content creators, and I got to thinking that it's a little bit like another historical movement, like the Italian Renaissance, which never didn't really have any one leader. And the leading lights of the Italian Renaissance weren't in competition with each other. It wasn't like Leonardo da Vinci competed with Michelangelo, competed with Titian, competed with Brunelleschi. They all did different things, and so they didn't compete with each other for anything other than mastery. And it was a little bit like this with all these different men. And so I found myself wondering, this is this historical process that doesn't have any leaders, where everyone's pushing towards excellence. It's like a men's renaissance. And so I came up with the term the Renaissance of Men.
Hmm. Awesome. So, as far as specifically your platform,
Mm.
what's kind of the goal of Renaissance of Men?
There's lots of goals. um, the goal of of the podcast was originally to let other people know that the Renaissance was going on.
Hmm.
But then I realized that, and it's fairly obvious in retrospect, that people don't think of it as a Renaissance. I'm the only guy
Hmm.
thinking of it that way. So the goal became to propagate the idea of the Renaissance itself, and the content creation, Twitter and Instagram particularly, and then on YouTube are all furthering that mission. But the thing is, I actually got into this business because I wanted to be a psychotherapist, and counsel men, because I've had my own transformation. I've done, different retreats and modalities and facilitation. But in 2020, when the world kind of melted down, I realized, why would I spend 3 to 5 years in school to be a therapist here in Phoenix, where I live, alone, and only be able to work in this area when there are millions of men around the world that I don't think need therapy. They need coaching, mentorship, and masculinity along the same lines of what I did. So I got into this to work one-on-one with men. So in addition to propagating this idea of the Renaissance as this larger collective process that we're in, I also do men's mentorship programs, 3-month men's mentorship programs. And then I've had my own life profoundly affected by men's groups. And so I host men's groups for men to connect and share experiences with each other as well, to sort of go from the highest level historical flows to the lowest level, like working with a guy on whatever challenge he's facing. And so I'm sort of all of those.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's I think John Eldredge also is credited for saying that men don't need more self-help, they just need permission to be men. And it sounds like you're
Yes.
slightly providing an avenue for that with some of your groups.
Yes. I mean, I think that when John Eldredge was writing, excuse me, when John Eldredge was writing, I don't think, if that was in Wild at Heart, I don't think the problem was as far advanced as it is today, because men need
Right.
much more than permission.
Hmm.
Many men are they grew up without fathers, or they're underfathered if they did have fathers. And so they not only need permission, they need support, they need encouragement, they need support, and they need to learn to trust themselves. And that's not always easy, because everything in our society, everything in media says that men and women are equal in all ways, but women are better. That's the message, right?
Yeah.
That's the double think of I'm not even going to call it feminism anymore for anything other than a handy label. It's something much more than that now. But they have to unwire this idea that they're second class citizens,
Hmm.
and that their natural desires are good. If they want to be husbands and fathers, and they want to lead a family, that's okay.
Yeah.
And that they have and that if they meet difficulty, and they meet misfortune and struggle, that they can see their way through it if they just don't quit on themselves. And the thing that I'm noticing more than ever now is that men need to hear that they matter, because
Hmm.
no one's ever told them. And this theme keeps coming up over and over again. No one's ever told them that they matter.
Yeah.
Like, hey, you're important, and you're so important that you have to care for yourself. That idea is like, men will tell me it's really difficult for them to internalize the idea that they matter.
Hmm.
And it's way more than just permission. I mean, I love
Yeah.
John Eldredge, and he's right, but
Oh,
I
for
think it's
sure.
much more than that now.
Well, I completely agree with your assessment because, like you said, he was writing in the 90s. And,
Yeah.
when you think of the change that has happened from the 90s to 2022,
Yeah.
there's a whole lot of that's gone on in the past, 2.5, 3 decades or so since Wild at Heart
Three
was first
years.
written. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, to go off what you said, the culture is not helping. Recently, James Cameron, who directed the Avatar movies and so many other movies that we consider to be great, groundbreaking films, recently described testosterone as a toxin that
Ridiculous.
men need to terminate from their system. So, what was your reaction to that?
I had fun with that one. I mean, James Cameron, let's not forget, was the director of, how many different Arnold Schwarzenegger movies? Terminator 1, Terminator 2, True Lies. Were there others? In addition to Aliens and The Abyss. These are hyper masculine movies. I mean,
Yeah.
now what James Cameron was brilliant at was crafting strong female characters who didn't overshadow the men. Like in The Abyss, Ed Harris's character's wife, Sarah Connor, right? Especially in Terminator 2, Jamie Lee Curtis in True Lies. These are excellent movies that are very high testosterone movies. And so the idea that James Cameron would say testosterone is a toxin after he's made $1 billion off of it, it's hypocrisy. It's pure hypocrisy. And no one's ever going to, the problem is no one's going to hold him to account for that. Because if he really thinks it's a toxin, pull all your films and donate all the money you made from it, Jim. How about that?
Right.
Right?
Right.
Oh, it's so toxic that you give back your entire fortune. Oh no, you're happy to keep the money. Okay, sure, got it. Okay, happy to make
Yeah.
money off you guys and then insult you. But sadly, he's not alone. Look at Arnold
No.
Schwarzenegger. Arnold Schwarzenegger himself came over from Austria and became who knows how many hundreds of millions of dollars he made as a bodybuilder and then an
Hmm.
actor and an icon and a politician. And with 3 words, he wrecked his entire legacy. Screw your freedom. It's like,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's like,
That was
so
so ridiculous.
it's ridiculous. And here's God's justice, right? So you spend your entire life making money off of freedom, and then at the end of your life, when you're in your 70s and all your juice is gone and you're not, your peak is past, you wreck your legacy with no ability to reconstruct it. I mean that's
Mm.
just. I mean there's a justness aspect to that as well. And same with
Yeah.
Jim Cameron. He like Jim Cameron. I don't. This is the thing that doesn't make sense to me. I heard that Avatar 2 has to make $2 billion to break even. And so he just insulted half of the planet. Like, okay,
Yeah.
good luck with that.
Yeah. And we're already at a time where I don't think people are super keen on going to the movies too. So probably not the wisest move. But both of those men, when you were talking there, I immediately just thought those are two men that they made it, and instead of reaching back and reaching to the guy that's a step below them to give him a hand up, instead they're just trying to burn the ladder behind them so that no one else can make it to the top, which is ironic because James Cameron is coming out saying that testosterone is toxic, but you can argue that what he's doing is a trait of an unhealthy man,
Mm-hmm.
where it's a very aggressive move to basically try to make it to where no one else can take the same path that he took that led to his success. And that's
Mm,
that's
it's a great
really, I
observation.
probably speaking of insecurities of his own.
Oh yeah, that's a wonderful observation. Even if we're taking it at face value that he said it because he actually believes it versus what was put up to it to keep his job or whatever, it's like, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, kind of the way that Hollywood
Mm.
works. If we take him at his word, you're right. He could very much be like, testosterone is a toxin, so no one can make these movies anymore. It's like, okay, the
Right.
last successful director, right? Well, I mean, they're going to wreck Indiana Jones now too. So
Oh, good. Good. We need
yeah,
another one to be on the pike.
yeah,
Good grief. So, with all this conversation, I do want to talk about toxic masculinity. So,
sure.
first I'll throw it to you. Do you believe in toxic masculinity?
Yes, but it's not what people think it is. It's
Mm,
what people talk about is only half of the picture.
yeah, yeah, and I think that's kind of my thought too. I think that there are some individuals that do a disservice to many women and other men who have been wronged by what you and I would probably call toxic men, by saying that toxic masculinity just doesn't exist, period. And I think that comes from a place of playing defense, because obviously I think that guys like James Cameron, are attacking manhood in general in ways that are completely uncalled for.
Hmm.
And so I think out of defense, there's almost an overcorrection that sometimes occurs where they say that there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. So I would consider toxic masculinity to be, the kind of guy that's puffed up and, ready to brawl at the slightest sign of his insecurities being exposed.
Hmm.
I think that's toxic. So I would definitely say that there is toxic masculinity. I just wouldn't. I would say that that's not necessarily manly behavior, of course,
Hmm.
but it is technically something that would be testosterone filled or considered to be masculine, at least if we're talking what cultures defines as being a masculine trait. So, would you agree with my assessment?
I do, and the word that I use and that I've heard used for that is men who are macho.
Mm.
You know, that's toxic masculinity is some extreme degree of being macho. The
Yeah.
problem with the term though is that it's only half of the picture, because there's another kind of toxic masculinity. So the way that that term is often used is the man who is, let's say, too forward, too
Hmm.
aggressive, too assertive. And so but that word is used to shame other men, to say that this is what masculinity is. So what you get in response is you get men who shut themselves down completely and become passive and apathetic. That man, that passive and apathetic man, is also toxic,
Mm.
because what the overly aggressive man does is he takes up all the space in the room, and everyone's like, "Whoa, dude, back
Yeah.
down." Right? Okay. But the man who's passive and apathetic drains the room of its vitality. He contributes nothing. And whereas a man is supposed to come in and give energy to a room and be generative, right? Bring in his masculine spirit to animate. Like when a man walks into, like a real man walks into a room, you see everyone come to life, right? Especially a leader. When a leader walks into a room, everyone comes to life in a good way. When you
Right.
when you have a man who's passive and apathetic in that place instead, the whole room's energy sinks, and that's equally toxic. So when people talk about toxic masculinity, I say yes, and there's a whole other ditch on the other side of the road that doesn't get talked about. And so the reason why that matters is because toxic masculinity is what I call a shaming weapon. It's a
Hmm.
it's a it's a rhetorical device that's been honed over decades, 6 or so decades, if not more, in feminist academia.
Yeah.
Some of the smartest and most devious minds taking decades of feminist literature and whittling it down into a very fine point, and then launching it through social media like Twitter
Mm.
and Facebook and stuff. So it's a weapon. And
Yeah.
what it's aimed to do, what that phrase aimed toxic masculinity is aimed to do, is strike right at the heart of a man, make him ashamed for being a man. And
Yeah.
it works. It's worked really well as a rhetorical weapon. It strikes these men and it shuts them down, which is what it's designed to do. And as long as you leave it there, then it's effective. But as soon as you point out a man being in that flattened state as a result of that, who is apathetic and weak, drains vitality of the room as being equally toxic, as long as you leave him there, there's no rebound. But if you let him know, like, hey, when you stop in that spot, that's being toxic, you need to pick yourself up and discover what it really means to be a man, then that unwinds the whole thing and it puts you back on offense rather than defense.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there, and it's like it's being circulated around. So maybe
Sure.
it's a bit corny, but it's like the saying that strong men create good times create weak men create bad times create strong men, and the
Sure.
cycle is ever continuing. But that's the truth of what you're saying, is now we sort of have this toxic apathy from men on the flip side of the toxic bravado that we see.
Yes. But what I try to do with the Renaissance of men as a value is I want to exit the cycle. I don't want to create strong men who create good times and keep that wheel
Hmm.
turning. What I want to understand is the reason why the strong men created the good times, which is obviously a good thing, is men didn't actually know what they were doing and why it was important.
Mm.
They were just left to do it. They let the
Yeah.
flywheel of society run, right? Which is great, but the men weren't self-reflective. In the past 30 years, 40 years, there has been more writing about masculinity than ever before.
Mm.
Books, videos, and content. Like, it's insane the amount of reflection that's been done about what it means to be a man, unprecedented in history. And so, my hope is with the Renaissance of men that with all of that collective wisdom, we can move forward with a conscious understanding and an awareness of what it means to be a man, and not be unself reflective about it, and not let it go too far to where we're being irresponsible and creating this irresponsible good time, right? Where we know that these values need to be passed on. Because I
Mm.
think you can look at men of like the greatest generation, not necessarily boomers, but their fathers. They were being
Yeah.
men, but they didn't know that that's what they were doing until their sons or their grandchildren became very much not men. So the idea is if we know what we're doing, we can actually pass those values along and never create those destructive good times. That's the notion where people can get spoiled and take it for granted.
Right.
That's what you don't want to have happen. It's not that good times are bad, it's that you don't pass along values that let people know don't take this for granted.
Right. Right. Well, it's kind of like our country's founders. I think that they did a good job of creating good times that lasted for a long time.
Yeah.
But a lot of that was because I think they were much more reflective. Whereas, when you're talking about the greatest generation, like you said, there was a evil that rose, in the East, and the men of the West had to go and meet that challenge. And it was not much time for thinking, just time for action. And, after the war, I think that there was a lot of just going back to whatever the new normal was, and which was a time of relative peace. And I think that that very next generation, though, was not fully appreciative or fully understanding of what they inherited. And I think that we immediately moved into kind of the next phase. And, a great book that I just read on that recently was Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell.
Mm,
That talked a lot about America since the 60s. And it really goes on to a lot of when the boomers kind of came into their prime, where a lot of the deterioration kind of came about. And obviously I'm not here to say that's all the boomers' fault. It's every generation has their has their contributions made, both for good and for bad. But
right.
either way, so how would you say that we should go about, assuming right now there's obviously a lot of craziness going on in our world, but obviously there is this renaissance happening.
Mm.
So how would you advise that we take this renaissance movement and create lasting change that can be inherited for future generations?
That's a great question. I mean, the first is to reinstate the centrality of the family.
Hmm.
That's essential. That's essential. I mean, if you, we can look at the state right now and say the state is a mess. The state has
Right.
been co-opted by people who are essentially anti-human. And depending on what church we're in, many churches are a mess as well. Not all, but many. But the one thing that we as individual men have control over is a family. And if
Hmm.
we can build order and structure and virtue and righteousness within a home and a relationship and pass those values on to kids, in a really disciplined way. And that discipline begins with ourselves, right?
Yeah.
To be a man and impose discipline on other people and not impose discipline on yourself is not to be a man.
Hmm.
You have
Yeah.
to be the example first. So I think it really begins with the family. And this is where my men's mentorship really comes in, is what I lay out for the men that I work with is ultimately, I think the desire that lives within most, if not every man's heart, is the desire to provide for and lead a family. This is where movies like
Hmm.
Fight Club, if you've seen the movie
Yeah.
Fight Club was a great movie, but it told a lie
Hmm.
fundamentally about men. And the lie was, if you let men be men, they'll tear down society.
Hmm.
Now that's absolutely, and it's also similar to the movie American Psycho and the book, both of those books. Um, and the thing, it couldn't be further from the truth, because what men actually do, if given the chance, is they get married and they have kids.
Hmm.
And to let men know that that desire is good and righteous and virtuous and beautiful and true, and to give them an understanding of, if you're going to get married and have kids, here's what you need to be doing with your time, depending on what stage of life you're at. Here's what you need to be doing with your time, your energy, your money, and your body, to really prepare to do that for a lifetime. And all this knowledge, it's used to be common knowledge, but
Right.
it's so far gone right now to just tell men that it's okay to want a wife and kids. It's okay to want to be a provider. It's
Yeah.
okay to want to have your wife, be a homemaker, not a housewife, but a homemaker. That's okay. And here's who you need to be as a man to facilitate that for her. Passing this information on to men, it's like the lights go off. It's like, come on, lights come on. Not that they go off, but
Right.
it's like a light goes off, right? It's like they've because it's laying out something that is true in their hearts that they felt for a long time, that I think is part of us, but it's so far gone that it's like this rebirth where it's like, oh, I know who I am. And so I think that's where it starts for men, and
Yeah.
groups of men who have done that with each other can come together and form communities, can form churches, and form much more. But it starts with the family, and it starts with how the man begins living his life and understands that if you do what the world tells you, you can see what the world is going to give you. So don't listen to the world. Go this
Hmm.
other way. And it's not hard to imagine what you'll get in exchange.
Yeah. Well, obviously, you're talking about something other than the world. So that would bring
Hmm.
me to the conclusion of, well, what's that other thing, which would make me, immediately think, okay, faith.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about your faith background.
That's how much time you got. So I have a very long faith story, a faith journey. I was baptized in 2020, became Christian, but I was
Hmm.
born Jewish,
Hmm.
and I was bar mitzvahed and everything. And I spent from that point 30 or so years exploring all different world religions and spiritual and new age practices, because I lived in the Bay Area as well. So you name it, from Jungian psychology to Buddhism and Hinduism and ayahuasca plant medicine and crystals and sound healing and,
Hmm.
and hypnotherapies. I mean, I've traveled to 35 countries around the world, and I've been to major religious festivals and did meditation retreats at the top of mountains. Like I've done it.
Wow.
And from a spiritual religious perspective, I'd really done it all. And through a series of, I can't really call them coincidences, but a series of providential events, I found my way into the last door, the one place I hadn't looked in, and it
Hmm.
had the answer to Christianity. It had the answers to all the questions that I'd accumulated after 30 years of searching. I needed the 30 years to give me the questions so that Christianity could answer them.
Wow.
Hmm.
Wow. Even that incredibly, I'm sure, cliff note version
Yes,
of your story, that still sounds like an incredible journey. So
it's a
you're
privilege.
fairly new to the faith overall, but it sounds like faith isn't necessarily a new concept to you,
Right.
but understanding maybe where our redemption truly lies is. So how would you say that your newfound faith in Christ has shaped you as a man?
What's funny about that is I found in Christianity, and I don't remember whether it happened before I got baptized or after. It was not. It was right in that time frame. But I started to realize that Christianity, as I started to understand different aspects of masculinity from my own experience and from my own reading, I began to notice, either just before I got baptized or just after, that it all lined up with the portrait of humanity that Christianity painted:
Hmm.
fathers, leadership, faith, um, uh, spiritual headship, providership, caring for one woman, celibacy, chastity, right? Premarital chastity. I mean, and all these things. And I was like, because I had studied all these different world religions, and none of them really painted the same picture that
Hmm.
Christianity did, particularly because Christianity focuses so heavily on the importance of family, that our lives here on earth matter. They matter profoundly, versus Eastern religions that says, matter is all illusion, samsara, which is the Buddhist idea. Um, and so once I started recognizing, excuse me, that all my masculinity studies mapped directly onto Christianity, it was just like, I mean, these two things. Now, I've studied religion, it's been a 30-year pursuit, and masculinity has been a 20-year pursuit. And to see these two streams of my life flow together at this
Hmm.
precise moment, when the whole world is shut down and worldwide travel isn't a thing like it used to be, and to have all these streams flow in together as a profound gift that I'm experiencing. So they all reinforce each other, and they make me more of the man that I'm meant to be than I've ever been before, and an enormous pain to people who disagree with me.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I can imagine. And we've talked we talked a bit on this podcast before about Christianity and masculinity within the church. Um,
Mm,
I mentioned before how John Eldridge, in the intro, I mentioned that he said that he believes the church has hurt masculinity and raised up a generation of men who are dutiful, detached from their heart, and bored. So, do
mm.
you agree with that assessment?
I mean, I'm relatively new to the church, so but I would agree with what I've seen so far. Yes, that
Hmm.
there is a sense of men who have grown up in the church wondering what does it mean to be a man, or not even asking the question to begin with. Right?
Hmm.
There's a sense in like what they've been passed about masculinity through the church has been lacking in some way, and so there's a series of questions that aren't even being asked. Let's put it that way.
Hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, men are leaving the church in large numbers. At
Mhm.
least that's what the statistics show. Obviously, we can argue about the exact quantity, but why do you think that is?
I mean, they're not given the things that men need to thrive as beings. So when we try to say that men and women are the same, right? What we end up doing is just turning men into women for the most part,
Hmm.
because women uh, have said for the past 150 years or so, if not, I mean, more, depending on how you look at it, that their experience of being around men is naturally oppressive,
Hmm.
right? That having to adapt at all to a man is oppressive. So what happens if you tear that all down? If you tear that all down, then men must accommodate to women. There's no such thing as gender is not a thing. There's no such thing as sex neutral. What you end up doing is just turning into something that appeals to women so they don't feel oppressed by the men. And so when you try to fit men into a framework that works for women, you have men losing their vitality and becoming that toxic masculinity, that form of it. And for men that have self-respect, and they're not going to deal with that in their church, they just leave. They just
Hmm.
leave. Because what are their options, right? They either accept the neutered, watered down version of themselves from the pulpit, right, which they're not going to do, which their entire being rebels against, or they're going to stand up and start a ruckus. And what they'll experience in response is pushback from the pastor and the elders and the entire, I mean, let's be honest, the whisper network of the women at most churches,
Hmm.
right? I'm aware of this, right? And so for a lot of men, they don't have the stomach for that fight. And so they just leave. And
Hmm.
it's not hard to understand why. If other people are getting fed by their church experience, let them have that. I don't think a lot of men would be like, you know what I need to do? I need to break this church right now,
Right.
right? Why? I've got enough going on in my life. I don't need to fight this battle. So it makes
Hmm.
sense to me.
Yeah. So, how do you think churches can do a better job reaching out to men?
I mean, they have to want to.
Hmm.
I mean, like, you can't. The thing is you can't just say we want to have more men here. What can we do? It's like no, you need to radically reevaluate your doctrines towards masculinity. Radically,
Yeah.
like that's. But most churches aren't going to do that
Hmm.
because they're not. Now, look, I can't. I go to a amazing church in Mesa, in Apologia with Jeff Durbin and James White. So
Yeah.
I'm only relaying what I've heard from other churches. So this is not my church, but what I've
Right.
heard from other churches is churches are actually run by the pastor's wife, right? And
Hmm.
so as long as it's run by the pastor's wife, why does the pastor's wife care if there are men in the church? Right? I mean, she
Hmm.
doesn't, right? Like, because if there were actually men, strong men in the church, they might actually start building a masculine culture within the church that challenges the implicit notions of feminism that have taken over not just American Christianity, but America. And that's going to be a lot of friction. So a
Hmm.
church has to actually actively want to masculinize itself to come into alignment with biblical and
Hmm.
Christian principles, not biblical principles, because that's a whole thing, but Christian principles, very different. If a
Right.
church wants to do that, they'll be successful at it. But my read is that not a lot of churches actually want to do that.
Hmm.
And so a lot of men are looking like, how can I start my own?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So what kind of, I guess to get more practical on that subject, what kind of um like action items would you say a church should take? Is that like more, men camp, is that going to be more, specific outreach activities, or is it something a
Hmm.
lot deeper than that?
If they actually want to sincerely begin attracting men.
Right.
Well, the first and the easiest thing to do, again, this is just what I've heard about other churches because I go to an excellent church, is, excuse me, to begin changing the music. That
Mm,
there are two kinds of songs, and that they have names. One is a hymn, and the other is, I don't know, something else. That's a hymn, and it's something else. It's actually a technical term. One kind of song is a song to Jesus, and the other kind of song is a song about Jesus. So the
mm,
songs to Jesus and God are very relational. Like that's the kind of Jesus is my boyfriend kind of stuff that you might have heard of. It's, Jesus come into my heart,
mm,
those kind of songs.
right.
Those are like singing to person appeals to women because women are very relational by nature. Now the songs that are about Jesus are more hierarchical, right?
Mm,
Descriptions of God, of Jesus, that appeals to men. So the first and
mm,
the easiest thing that churches can do is singing more songs about Jesus and about God, and that those kind of songs will appeal more to men than the kind of songs that say Jesus, I love you, and things like that. Men won't feel comfortable saying those songs because they wouldn't say it. They probably wouldn't say it to their fellow brother. They definitely don't want to sing it. So that's, and some of these ideas come from the book Muscular Christianity by Brett McKay from The Art of Manliness. That's a great
mm,
book. There was a movement in the first half of the 20th century called Muscular Christianity that was propagated by Teddy Roosevelt, I think, and
mm,
it was, as the title said, it was focused on manly virtues within Christianity. And
mm,
so I would recommend anyone listening to read that book to get a sense of what a really manly church would look like and how churches can serve men. But it can begin with the music. I think men camp. It depends on what you do. I think
right.
men only groups would be good, like men's ministry groups. I think it'd be good and really get into the details about what men specifically need support with in their lives because men face different challenges from women. I think somewhere in there is a good place to start.
Yeah.
Oh, and do expositional preaching on the Book of Proverbs. That'll be another one.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Wow. Well, man, there's so much there, and I
Mm.
know that we're already getting to the end of our conversation here, so we'll definitely have to do at least a part two, if not part three, four, five, and however long I can abuse you for. So,
As
but
my podcasts go up to 5 hours, you can have me for a while.
perfect. There we go. Well, you have many conversations to go off of that with a lot of interesting guests, and um, I know that you've had a wide range of different people on your podcast. So, are you beginning to see any positive trends starting to repeat within the conversations that you're having?
Yes, I think some of the trends that people are beginning to realize that there's a significant overlap between masculinity, Christianity, and Bitcoin. Those three subjects
Hmm,
are merging together in very powerful ways. I think people are starting to realize that there is a wave building of conversation about masculinity. That it's not just in isolated pockets. That people are beginning to experience it in various aspects of their communities and families. Those would probably be the two biggest trends off the top of my head. And then maybe actually, I would say the third one is an increasing acceptance of men doing things like psychotherapy or inner self work. Because for the men's movement for a very long time has been very focused on discipline and structured action in the world, the doing aspect of being a man, less
mhm,
so on the being aspect of being a man. And the conversation seems to be balancing itself out in some positive ways towards let's talk about what men do and let's talk about what it means to actually be a man inside.
hmm. That's awesome.
Hmm.
So, if you don't mind going a little later
Of
to
course.
to talk about something that I really wanted to make sure that we went into, because you recently had a whole Twitter thread on courage.
You saw it.
So
Okay.
I did. And Winston Churchill, I wanted to go ahead and give you a Winston Churchill quote. He said the
Mm,
following. He said, "Courage is rightly considered the foremost of the virtues, for upon it all others depend." He
mm,
also said, "Without courage, all other virtues lose their meaning." So, what
hmm.
comes to mind when you hear those quotes?
Well, I mean, without courage, any other virtue is meaningless because courage is a quality of mind. Gosh, I wish I could remember the exact definition that I used in my Twitter thread, but it,
Hmm.
it, it can meet danger or fear, danger or trouble without fear, is essentially the definition. That courage is a quality of mind that allows a man to meet danger or trouble without fear, right?
Hmm.
So it doesn't matter how strong you are, or how masterful you are, or skillful, or wealthy. None of those things matter if at the moment when danger or trouble presents itself, you become afraid and you don't stand up. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how much money you have. It
Hmm.
doesn't matter your muscles. Doesn't matter even a little bit. It like because when the chips are really down, when everything is really on the line, if you can't show up in the face of risk, it was all for nothing. And we can see this. I didn't put this in the courage thread, but I suppose I could have. We see this in the Lord of the Rings, right?
Hmm.
You would look at Aragorn or Gandalf and all these guys and think, oh, those are the most significant characters, and they are very significant. But all Frodo has as a character, he doesn't have muscles. He barely even has a sword, right? He has a small little like a hobbit-sized sword. So it's a sword has a story, but it's not a giant broadsword. It's not
Right.
it's not God, what's the name of the sword? Anyway, it's not that. It's not the sword that is reforged, right? All he has is courage. And the entire, success of Middle Earth hinges on his courage. And that's it. And so I would say Winston Churchill is very right that if a man lacks courage, and what I talked about in the thread is plenty of men lack courage today. They have
Hmm.
money, they have status, they have success. You see all their faces and all their names all over the media all the time. But when the decisive moment shows up to show real courage, you just they don't have it. But
Yeah.
our media hides that fact from us. It
Hmm.
hides, and because real courage isn't in doing the thing that for me, in doing the thing that you would find scary. So for example, like if you might find it scary, maybe you don't, but you might find it scary to be on TV. So that would be courage for you to be on TV, right?
Right.
But someone who's more comfortable with being on TV doesn't require courage for them. The
Right.
part that requires courage for them is the questioner asking them a hard truth and telling the hard truth and not shading the meaning. That's what would show courage for them. So each man has his different challenges of courage. And so in our hyper mediated environment, we see lots of men that are doing things that might scare us, but are they doing the things that scare them? That's the
Hmm.
bigger question. And I would contend that they aren't, because if we had more courageous men, maybe the world might be in a better spot today.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So, how can men be more courageous?
You have to practice.
Hmm.
I mean, that was what I talked about in the thread, is that really, you don't want to test your courage by doing something that's absolutely terrifying, right? Because I think courage is like a muscle. So
Hmm.
you have to find things in your everyday life that you have to find danger or trouble in your everyday life and expose yourself to it and to step up and do the hard thing. Now, there's lots of different ways that can show up. I mean, one of the ways is you can call someone and apologize for something. Like we all carry around things that we don't feel good about that we did or said in the past. Pick up the phone and apologize. That's courage, because that's really risking danger. Sorry, not
Yeah.
danger, trouble. Danger is an objective physical thing. I think trouble is like a social thing, like you're in trouble.
Hmm.
So
That's a
you
good
can risk
distinction.
trouble. Yeah, yeah. So you can risk trouble by picking up the phone, and you can train your courage muscle that way. To really the challenge is danger, because I don't know that there are any ways available now that it's really practical to experience real danger. Like you
Hmm.
can, you can decide you're going to sleep in the forest naked overnight or something like that. Like that's kind of dangerous.
Right.
Like, but is it worth it? Right. Although I did have a discussion with a friend of mine that I think the most dangerous accessible thing that people can do is actually sailing. Sailing is like
Hmm.
if you do, maybe you don't have to do open ocean sailing like I've done in the past, but if you learn to really sail and you go out quite a bit, quite a ways away from the shore, like you're just kind of out there and the ocean is not your friend. So I think
Right.
sailing is a good and complicated way to experience danger that's controllable. And so I've been trying to think of something else.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to do like free solo climbing. That's pretty crazy, but
Yeah. Courage is often a choice too. And, that's kind of what you're
yeah.
going with. We can choose to be courageous, but obviously finding practical baby steps to sort of strengthen that muscle is going to be key to seeing actual growth in terms of, an individual's actual ability to face something that they're nervous about or worse, terrified of. So,
Mhm.
yeah, well, that's definitely something that we'll have to touch more on in a future conversation. But do you have any
Yeah.
any closing encouragement that you want to leave the viewers with today?
Yeah, I just would like them to think about how all the different things that we've talked about, you and I have talked about, are connected. Building more masculine churches, this whole notion of a renaissance, courage, right? Um, all these ideas, they all, and our current state of the world, all these ideas are very connected. And starting a family, pushing back on the dogma that we've received in culture, answering hard questions of faith and being able to live by the answers. All these things very much fit together, and they all fit together into what it means to be a man. Not in any kind of philosophical sense, though there is that, but in a sense of an embodied sense. Like, no, this is what it means to be a man, in the sense I'm doing it. Not I'm thinking
Mm.
about it, but I'm doing it. So just be thinking about all the different ways that these can fit together, dear listener, in your own life.
Awesome. Well, Will, where can people find you if they want to keep up with you and everything that you're doing?
You can find me at renofmen.com. That's my website. You can find links to my podcast and all my social media pages at linktree/renofmen. And if you head over to renofmen.com/mentorship, you can see my brand new 12-week men's mentorship page that I'm building right now. I'm very excited to share some of the success stories of my clients and share more about that side of what I do. Renofmen.com/mentorship.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Will. It was a great conversation. I look forward to having you back on in the near future to talk through all the other stuff that we did not get to today. But really appreciate your time.
Me too, Connor. Thank you so much. I appreciate your listeners for going a little bit overboard in terms of time as well.
Absolutely. And we have been Forge and Anvil. So thanks so much, everyone, for listening. Feel free to go to forgeandanvil.locals.com if you'd like to support the show. Thanks so much.